Fascinating. There are two fascinating questions here. One is, what leads the jihadists to moderation? And then what leads them to extremism? Before we talk about extremism, what you're suggesting in your book, as we listen to the words and listen to your analysis, is that important factions of the jihadists essentially were ready to turn to moderation in light of the fact that what had happened to them in prison, where they not only were tortured, but in fact began thinking about the inadequacies of their own politics.
By mid-1990s, local jihadis like Kamal Habib is part of the first generation, or the leader of the first generation, were defeated. And they asked the question, where do we go from here? The overwhelming number of local jihadis decided to basically call it quit. They decided to take a break. They decided to call for a unilateral ceasefire against the near Arab enemy, Arab and Muslim governments. But a tiny faction within the jihadist movement, led by Ayman Zawahiri and other jihadis like Osama bin Laden, they basically, and those are part of when I went to Egypt and Yemen and other places, and I began interviewing jihadis in the 1990s, a great debate raged in the 1990s, where do we go from here? And this tiny faction within the jihadist movement, led by Ayman Zawahiri, made the argument that the only way to rescue the sinking jihadist ship was to shift the focus from the near enemy, Arab and Muslim governments, to the far enemy, the United States and its allies. And Ayman Zawahiri, in memos written to his lieutenants in Yemen and Egypt and London and other places, argued the only way for us to survive is to basically attack the head of the snake being the United States, because he argued, and this is in the late 1990s, Harry, he said, when we attack the far enemy, the head of the snake will likely lash out angrily against the Ummah being the Muslim community worldwide. And when the far enemy lashes out against the Ummah, we would rise up and basically take arms against the far enemy. We would gain, he said, quote unquote, we would gain credibility in the eyes of the Ummah. We failed against the near enemy because we could not convince Arab and Muslim population. We had a vision. In fact, one of the reasons why the jihadist movement, Harry, lost against the near enemy, it could not create a viable social base. It could not convince Arab and Muslim population they had a vision, a viable vision. And Ayman Zawahiri and others argued that the only way to do so, to create a viable coalition, was to attack the far enemy and basically polarize the world into two camps. The camp of belief, led by Al-Qaeda and the new, what I call the transnationalist jihadis, and the world, or the camp of unbelief, led by the far enemy, the United States and its allies.
In your narrative, again and again, you've already discussed Lebanon, and you go on to discuss other external events. I mean, they're internal to the region, but they involve external actors. We can't go into all of these, but I made a list here because here in the United States, there is a failure of history, of remembering the sequence of events and so on. And so, so we have to understand that as we move to the next generation, these individuals, both the soldiers and the theorists, are affected by events such as the establishment of the State of Israel, the 1967 war, the Lebanese Civil War, the rise of Khomeini, the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. funding of the Mujahideen in order to counter the Soviet invasion, the Iran-Iraq War, the invasion of Kuwait and the employment of American troops on Saudi soil, and then the Iraq War I and the Iraq War II. So all of these, in a way, these subsequent generations are experiencing these events, drawing conclusions from them, and becoming radicalized to a new level with new tools. But in the case of al-Qaeda, it's very important to understand that al-Qaeda emerged out of groups that we were supporting in order to counter the Soviet invasion.
I mean, history really is critical to the story. I mean, if we label transnationalist jihadis as evildoers, as I mean, the administration has done, the end of discussion and debate. I mean, if they are evildoers, there's no reason to understand history, politics, sociology, and the various factors that have shaped their views. No one is suggesting that they are not murderers. Any attacks on civilians anywhere in the world is terrorism, period, the end of the story. But we need to understand the story. We need to understand why in the late 1990s, a group of religious activists, who we call transnational jihadis, decided to target the United States. And as you said, I think the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was truly critical, Harry, to understanding the story of the second generation. I would say that the 1967 war between Israel and its Arab states was pivotal for the creation for the first generation. Mm-hmm. But in the case of what I call the Al-Qaeda generation or the Afghan Arab generation, the Afghan war was critical.